Today, we're back to finish up the video series on the Nick Cannon situation. We're going to be talking about my final thoughts on Nick's comments, cancel culture, and the history of the weaponization of the words anti-Semitic and racism for political purposes. Stick around, it's going to be a good one. So, the last couple of videos, if you got a chance to check them out, they've been out for a few days now. We went over everything that Nick actually said and why I don't think a whole lot of it was incorrect. And the parts that were incorrect are not to be taken literally as beliefs. This is going to sound like hand-waving if you didn't watch the videos. It's really not. Everything Nick said was completely easily summed up in its source, either as being reframes of common white supremacist arguments that no one actually believes anymore. That's, why people were calling him racist. The other side of the coin, things like the melanin comments are reversals of the common idea that white people were better simply because of skin tone. It made them more spiritually pure. He was just making a play on the same nonsense argument. And then his comments on anti-Semitism, or rather what was reported as anti-Semitism, which was just to say that black people were original Hebrews. Black people are Semitic people. Now, the Bible makes that claim itself. That's not a claim that's unique to Nick. It's just the modern world has reinterpreted the Bible for a number of different reasons. That's going to be a video coming down the pipe, probably in the next 2 weeks. Expect to see my thoughts on fake Christianity and the way Christianity is co-opted through the history of Europe to make a white supremacist argument that isn't there in the original text at all. Then he made comments saying essentially something to the effect that, actually, I don't think he made the comment. I think it was the fact that he had Dr. Griff, I think was the guy's name on, was seen as inherently anti-Semitic because Dr. Griff had made comments, I think back in the 80s, that, essentially Jews run the media, that kind of nonsense. Which, again, if you go back to the first video I did in the series, that notion is just a Nazi propaganda notion. I mean, that's the exact thing that Hitler said as to why the Nazi Party needed its own propaganda arm, was because Jews controlled the media. So, there's this complicated history that we went over in the first video where anti-Semitism and straight up Nazi propaganda leached itself into black nationalism through the Nation of Islam, and through weird connections that the Nation of Islam had to white supremacists, and the comfortableness of integrating white supremacist ideas in the reverse into the Nation of Islam's ideology, which that's where all of this stuff comes from, this whole conversation. So, at this point, what are you supposed to say about what Nick said? Obviously, he was misguided. Clearly, he was misguided. It was a dumb thing he said and did. Not because it came from a place of malice. I didn't get the sense watching that podcast that he had a sense of malice over white people or Jewish people or anybody. And in fact, one of the things that black nationalists have said from the beginning is, we don't hate you, we're just about us. Because no one has been about us in society. So we do it for ourselves. It's an admirable notion. I mean, I think looking at it that way is completely understandable why certain isolationist attitudes and perspectives have come up. But a lot of the rhetoric is very nasty. They're echoes of the nastiness of the white society onto black people for hundreds of years. And if it offends you, it should. Racism is offensive. Anti-Semitism is offensive. It really doesn't matter who's doing it to who for it to be offensive. But the problem is power exists. And a lot of this video is going to be about power more than anything else. Because what does it mean to be canceled? That's a huge, huge question that we need to ask if we're going to talk about this cancel culture that everyone keeps talking about. And yet very rarely do I ask, or do I hear asked, what does it mean to be canceled? In Nick's case, he was literally canceled from a television show that he was the main creative force for. Wild and Out, I think. I've never seen it. I'm not a big TV person. Don't expect me to know much about any of it. But Nick had apparently a very successful show, MTV or VH1, I forget which, one of those two, I always get them confused. And he was fired by Viacom, which is one of the largest companies on earth. So there was a massive power difference between Viacom, Nick Cannon, all the people commenting about Nick Cannon, journalists and other cultural figures, and average people. They are all massive differences in power. And the relationship between power and capital and ideology is a conversation that goes really deep in this country. And as a channel, we're going to be talking about this more and more and more, going into deeper and deeper layers and facets and the way that this same problem affects so many different things. But the problem with cancel culture is that there's a problem with power. That's today's video. So Nick Cannon gets canceled, so he gets removed by Viacom from this TV show. He's still a very popular and beloved cultural figure. So he didn't get canceled by people. He got canceled by VH1. He got canceled by a large company. He then tried to apologize for what he did to try to get his show back. And then he got almost canceled by people. Because they didn't want him to apologize. And it really wasn't about what he said. It was just the fact that literally the whole week leading up to the Nick Cannon situation, all we heard about as a society, if you were paying attention to social media at all, was this Harper's letter, where all these cultural figures from elite cultural institutions like, journalists in major newspapers, academics from large colleges, all signed this letter saying that they're against cancel culture. And yet right after that, someone gets canceled. And it wasn't the left who canceled him. Keep that in mind, okay? It wasn't the left that did it. And the narrative that we keep hearing about cancel culture is this, these leftists, these radical leftist social justice warriors on Twitter are canceling everybody. No. No. The left didn't cancel Nick Cannon. Number one, and we're going to get into this later in the video, the left does not equate any mention of a Jewish person and any criticism of Israel as being the same thing, nor is any of it considered anti-Semitic until it starts to cross into legitimate anti-Semitic bounds. And some people interpret that as the left has an anti-Semitism problem because they're way quicker to call out white on black racism than they are to call out anti-Semitism. That's a reality. So the majority of what people took offense to was the anti-Semitic comments and the anti-white comments, both of which the left don't really have that much of a problem with right now. And that is an actual legitimate criticism from the right to the left, is that they really don't have a problem with anti-white racism. And I will tell you the reason why is because they don't believe in the concept of white anymore. Leftists are sick and tired of having to have the same cultural tag as horrible, fucking vicious racists in the GOP who keep stomping on civil rights. I don't want to be in a group with those people. A lot of people don't want to be in a group with those people. And when the attitudes have been studied, liberal and leftist-minded people have a negative attitude towards their own race when they are white. That doesn't happen in any other racial group. And it is entirely a product of white people looking at other white people and saying, we're sick to death of that racist behavior. So when someone comes with a criticism of whiteness, and that criticism of whiteness is based on that white people are inherently racist, the left hears that and goes, yep, consistent with the way that I perceive the world. Because almost every white person I've met in my life has been racist on some level or another. That is a valid criticism. I'm even willing to take that criticism onto myself and say that even though I'm relatively well informed on racial issues, I could be subliminally racist. I grew up in a white supremacist society. It's the reality of it. There could be ways that I don't even realize that I am doing some sort of psychic disharm to groups that I don't understand. That's why I take it on myself to try to educate myself, for the record. And you should too, for the record. But that doesn't mean that when I hear, white people are inherently racist, that I have to buck against it and I have to say it's wrong. The people who buck against it and say it's wrong, the word for those people is reactionary. Reactionaries are generally conservatives. They're generally right-wing. There are left-wing reactionaries who don't have valid political opinions until somebody says something that annoys them and then they go after them. That is true. I'll admit that exists. But most of the reactionary forces in this country are definitely on the right wing. They're definitely in the GOP. They're definitely conservatives. Now, the reason that reactionary attitude is problematic is because it's hypocritical. Every time that you see a reactionary attitude play itself out, it stomps on other points that person is making. Because when you're being a reactionary, you can't think through the way that affects your overall philosophy. One of the biggest criticisms of the GOP from the left is that it doesn't have a consistent philosophy other than deregulating the economy and destroying the government. All of its social positions are just contrarian to whatever the opposite of the Democrats want. So the Democrats want, better access to birth control pills. The right opposes that. Left wants gun control. Right opposes that. But with this cancel culture thing, when the left does it, so when the left points out racism in somebody in the GOP, the reactionaries all come out and say, this is bad. This is against free speech. But when somebody on the left does something that the right can take advantage of, they have no problem with cancel culture. And the reality of the historical situation is that the reactionary end of things started cancel culture long before the left ever got a hold of it. Here's what I mean by that, okay? All throughout this country's history, we have had a problem with censorship. Theoretically, this free speech debate pins itself on the First Amendment. Theoretically. First Amendment says the government can't jail you or censor you for criticizing the government. That's, more or less the extent to the right of free speech to individuals. You have the right to religion, and journalists have the right to print news stories. Those are the protections in the First Amendment. What was supposed to be protected by the First Amendment has been walked over through the entire history of this country. If you go back into the last century and you look at public intellectuals who had leftist views, they were heavily censored. They were run out of jobs. There was a whole period in this country that we call McCarthyism, where the right was canceling people on the left for being leftists. And here's where Israel comes back in, because the reactionary end of this country has been using and weaponizing the word anti-Semitism against people who criticize Israel for decades. That was happening long before Twitter and Me Too and cancel culture, but it is the exact same phenomenon and process. You said something that upset the wrong people. But before Twitter, before the common people had a mass voice that could be easily mobilized, the people you didn't want to annoy were powerful people. So if you annoyed the wealthy families that controlled politics, then the political reactionaries would come after you and silence you. You see? And they would weaponize words against you, like anti-Semitic, un-American, communist, socialist, anarchist. All of these are words that have been intentionally twisted and conflated to be things that the right could weaponize to try to cancel somebody, to try to diminish their cultural influence. So I don't ever want to hear that this is a radical left problem or a social justice problem ever again. Actually, quite the opposite. The roots were in reactionaries using these sorts of tactics to combat social justice. And they had no problem being racist at the same time while they did it. There were signs back in the 60s that said race mixing is communism. Those were probably the two scariest words in the white world at that time, race mixing and communism. So you put those two things on a sign together and dear God, you have a black and red scare on your hands. And that's exactly what this country did for decades. Decades and decades and decades. You want to know who started cancel culture in this country? The KKK. Yeah. They would show up and burn a cross on your lawn and let you know that you'd been canceled from that community. So it's really not a radical left problem. What it is you get to a point where people are getting canceled, where society is saying your behavior is so fucked up that we're going to oppose you in a wide scale and organized way. You get to that point when things are very, very polarized. When people don't want to talk it out. So the roots of cancel culture and being used by reactionaries and racists because they didn't want to talk out racial progress. They wanted to stamp it out. Now, we had a period where in the 90s, I think, was the peak of it, but you could make an argument it goes back into the 80s and forwards into the early 2000s, that we look back on and we call the PC era. The PC era was the era all of the millennials and the Gen Zers, who are now the super anti-racist advocates that you see on Twitter today, we all grew up under PC ideology. And what does that mean? We were all taught from a very early age that racism was incorrect. Anti-Semitism is incorrect. We're not doing those things as a culture anymore. And so when our generation gets confronted with obvious racism, you know, we watched for decades people tried to talk it out with these people who just want to stamp out civil rights. We learned that there's no conversation to be had with a racist if you are pro racial integration and racial harmony. There's no conversation there. So you have to stamp it out. There is no room for this stuff in this country anymore. And let me tell you with 100% clarity that unless everyone in this country gets on board and eliminates racism from their inner vocabulary, from their inner perspectives, eliminates anti-Semitism, and then starts working on the actual issues in this country, if we don't do that, we are heading for a social collapse. The same thing that caused, in the second video, we talked about how Rome collapsed, Constantinople collapsed. America is collapsing right now. Look outside. Watch the news. There are riots and protests all across the country. There have been all summer. People despise each other's political opinions now. Polarization is at a higher point than any time in American history than right before the Civil War. And very smart, educated people on global theory and politics have run simulations about what is going to happen in this country, and almost every simulation is coming back violence in the streets. That's not accidental. We didn't get to this point out of nowhere. We got to this point out of decades and decades and decades of refusing to address the issues and weaponizing words to retaliate against people who try to address the issues. So, if I am an advocate in the 1920s of better working conditions, I'm called a socialist, I'm thrown in jail. I'm called an anarchist, I'm thrown in jail. If that is not considered criticism of the government that should be protected under free speech, I don't know what is. Which proves the whole way through this country, there has been no constitutional protection for free speech aside from free speech which is acceptable to the power structure. So going back to something that I brought up earlier, you have the government and massive corporations which have an extreme amount of power. You have influential cultural icons like Nick Cannon, like journalists, etc. And you have individual people who have almost no power whatsoever unless they have wealth. So people, individual people, have never had in this country real protection for their speech. You only have protection for your speech insofar as your speech is protected and championed by the elites. So if you look at the current climate in politics in this country, this polarized atmosphere, the left is saying, we want to eliminate racism, we want a better society, we want workers' rights and equality. The right is saying, we don't care what you want, you whiny, sissy communists, go home. And the polarization gets worse and worse. The likeliness of violence gets worse and worse. And in the context of that, the only free speech that seems to be protected is the free speech of the right. So all through 2016, we heard that Nazis needed to have free speech. We can't let Nazis get canceled and deplatformed. That would be such a crime against humanity, to let a Nazi not be able to spread Nazi propaganda. An awful crime. That's what people wanted you to believe in 2016 through to today. That was the elite consensus. You can't cancel the right just because they're conservative and they have conservative opinions. They're not conservative, the ones that are getting canceled. They're outright fascists and white nationalists. There is a difference. The difference is just muddied because there are just so goddamn many of them. In fact, the Conservative Party is fucking full of them. So, if people are calling out racism, and that racism is being protected by elite opinion, then free speech benefits those white nationalists. Now, these same people who are free speech will also tell you that the protesters are breaking the law when they're using their free speech. They'll also tell you that people on Twitter organizing boycotts of companies who won't make change to their policy or fire problematic employees is not a valid form of speech. They'll tell you that that's more toxic cancel culture, even though for decades in this country we talked about how using your money to protest and boycott was legitimate. So the elite consensus is, if you're criticizing a right-wing person or an institution, that's not okay. If you're a left-wing person and you're protesting the government, that's not okay. But if you're a right-wing person doing the same thing, protesting, storming the Capitol with guns, that's perfectly fine. That's valid free speech. Going back to, an earlier point, I try to bring these threads up and then weave them back in. The conservatives, almost all of their points on social policy are completely hypocritical because of this effect. They're against cancel culture because they want to defend themselves from critique. They're for cancel culture if it affects their enemies. They're for free speech for themselves, but not for the left. And they've been doing this same trick for decades. That's why when you see leftists who say, I don't care, I'm not going to debate a conservative, I just want these people deplatformed. I don't care what they have to say, they're dangerous and vitriolic, and they should be removed and not allowed into public debate. Guess what? Just like Nick Cannon saying these old white supremacist ideas that are reversed, that's just the left saying what the conservatives have said for decades. We're not even going to let the left have a seat at the table because their ideas are beyond the pale. Well, the left is just doing the same trick in reverse. It's saying, look, we've had the same beliefs this whole time. We're anti-racist. We don't believe in canceling people. We just believe in not letting racists have platforms. And the right is saying, well, it's a free speech issue. They should have free speech. But you shouldn't have free speech to criticize them. Fucking please, man. If I listen to enough of someone's arguments and they can't be consistent over a course of time as to what they believe, they can't justify those beliefs in the face of valid criticism, that's not someone to be listened to. That's a liar. That's a propagandist. And I've not heard one cogent defense of Nick Cannon's comments coming from the free speech right. Where is it? Where's Barry Weiss and all of these other people who signed the Harper's letter to come out and say that Nick Cannon shouldn't have been fired by Viacom? It's a free speech issue, right? It's not about the criticism that elite cultural institutions get for being racially insensitive and white supremacist. It's not just a defense for that. No, we promise it's not. It's really about free speech. That's what we're saying is really about. And yet, the second that the next thing comes up that would reveal the hypocrisy behind the free speech argument, they just out themselves as hypocrites. Are we free speech or are we not? Is that the value that the conservatives want or not? Because if we value free speech, well, guess what? That means freedom to criticize Israel. It means freedom for black nationalists to say insensitive and racist things because white nationalists get to say insensitive and racist things under that free speech model. Or are we going to make a cultural commitment in this country to say that racism is not okay, lying is not okay, hypocrisy is not okay? Let's fix the fucking problems. But no, we're still at a gridlock. Everyone wants to be hypocritical about the subject. And it's because the hypocrisy is not anyone's fault, really. The hypocrisy is Cultural institutions need to be reformed desperately. And yet people who form the ladder of elite consensus make their money and their livelihood justifying those elite cultural institutions. So every time something comes up, there's a legion of millionaires and journalists and entertainers coming out to tell you why you should oppose your best interests and support the interests of large institutions. It's fucking bananas. It makes the entire intellectual culture in this country stifling and unbearable. Because people cannot express genuine political opinions in this country anymore. That we haven't been able to for years. If the left puts forward a genuine idea for progress, it's immediately punctured by a legion of sycophants to the billionaire owners of this country. And the right can't say anything without immediately being outed and shouted down by the populace, because the populace is fucking angry. Joe Biden keeps coming out and saying, we're not for Medicare for all. We're not for legalizing pot. We're not for defunding the police. We're going to give more money to the police and to the military. We're not going to repeal trade deals. On down the line, he's basically saying we're not going to do anything that the people actually want. They're fucking daring us to do something about it. The entire political institution is set up to shunt any possible change away from being capable and possible. And every time that people start to mobilize to try to change things themselves, they get gaslit and called some sort of name. Anarchist, communist, social justice warrior, whatever it is. Those words are getting weaponized to call you the real problem for trying to address the real problems in this country. Now, the left has been aware of this and has known it for a while. And that's why it stopped affecting the left to call someone racist or anti-Semitic a long time ago. I mean, the right loves to use these words. It uses the word racist now, mostly because it was targeted with it so successfully. The left turned that one around against the conservatives. And now they're coming right back and they're saying, anytime that you mention race, you're the real racist. If you mention racial differences in policing, you're the real racist. But then they'll turn around and tell you about black on black crime. Story for another day. The hypocrisy and the polarization keeps building. And it's not going anywhere. I mean, it's getting more and more obvious and surreal. The elite opinion flip-flops based on who's in trouble, based on, who's mad. If it's the population who's mad, they're being oversensitive and hypocritical. If it's the owners of the country who are mad, then the behavior of the people they're mad at is beyond the pale. It's fucking hypocritical. And nothing about it is about free speech. I promise you that. Because the right doesn't want free speech. Do you think Donald Trump wants free speech? They complain about it a lot because they're getting targeted. They've spread so much fake news and lies and propaganda that they get picked up on Twitter and, given 12-hour bans for spreading misinformation. But they don't want free speech. Quite the opposite. They want to control speech so that what they say is correct and what their enemies say is not correct. Not pro-free speech. They're making the free speech argument because they're losing power to the populace. And by weaponizing concepts like free speech and cancel culture, just like they weaponize concepts like anarchist and communist, they can try to shame people back into their box where they're politically unconscious and not attempting to make change. Now, do I think that Nick Cannon was particularly political conscious and trying to make change? No. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is, if we're a free speech culture, why didn't anyone actually listen to what Nick Cannon said and engaged him in a debate and told him why he's wrong? He obviously was willing to listen. He had a number of podcasts that week after where he talked to, rabbis and other cultural figures that told him why he was wrong, and he absorbed it. He was willing to listen. Fucking find me some Kentucky saltine who will sit down and listen to why social justice is actually the beneficial stance to this country, or why he should wear a mask to Walmart. They don't want to hear it. They're not interested in your speech. So to say it's free speech and open debate is a lie. It's just not true. That's not what it's about. The anti-free speech stuff coming from the right was mostly because it was being targeted by cancel culture for the first time. It had been doing it for decades to the left, and it doesn't like it when it happens to them. And this whole thing really, it just highlights so many issues around the way that we've been taught to frame arguments in this society. Like Colin Kaepernick taking a knee at an NFL game was stereotypical free speech. It could have been the definition of a free speech action, a free speech behavior. He's making a symbolic gesture that politely shows his political opinions and raises consciousness for it. It's no different than standing on a street side with a sign saying, support American veterans or defund the police or whatever your political opinion is. That's fundamentally free speech. Kaepernick was fired. Kaepernick was dragged in the media. He was called un-American by the same people who say that they're pro-free speech, who were adamantly pro-free speech a year before the Kaepernick protests and a year after. I mean, if you want to ask why the left has contempt for the right and doesn't want to hear their arguments, it's because their arguments are so hypocritical, so obviously see-through and hollow. I'm pro-free speech right up until somebody says something I don't like. Might as well be the most cliche, reactionary opinion on earth. It's all of them. It's every idiot free speech reactionary that I've found. The second you say something to them that they don't like, they don't want to hear it. They want the conversation over. Or they find some way to mentally block you out. I can't believe that in 2020 we are still capitulating to the arguments of people who support white supremacy. I'm speechless on the subject half of the time. It makes me so angry I can't think straight. That there are fucking senators and congressmen and a president in fucking DC making decisions for this country when they have direct contempt for 25% of the country based on race, 50% of the country based on gender, and they make fucking decisions for all of us with that contempt in the front of their thinking. And that's why we're in the position that we're in, by the way. Trump has an elite federal border protection unit kidnapping American citizens off of the street in Portland because they're using their free speech to criticize him. At the same time, right-wing political figures and elite cultural figures are saying that there's a free speech problem where the right can't express themselves. all I hear on the media are right-wing opinions. All I hear. That's all I hear. And really, left-leaning opinions, anti-racist opinions, are treated with mocking hostility and contempt by the wider culture. And I'm not even saying the Republicans, by the fucking Democrats as well. Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, their idea of racial solidarity is, let's not pass laws that help black people. Instead, we'll wear kente cloth and do a performative ceremony in the halls of Congress. Fuck out of here. I don't know where the fuck this country went wrong. The Democrats are not the party of FDR, and the Republicans are not the party of Eisenhower any fucking more. There's no sense to be made of politics in this country. It's arbitrary, gaslighting fucking nonsense on both sides. And the will of the people, what we call left-leaning opinions, are completely shut out of the conversation. And any time that the people try to take power into their own hands to make positive change, they're called troublemakers, insurrectionists, rioters, lootists, communists, cancel cultures, SJWs, fucking on down the list. What Nick Cannon said is probably 1/10 as offensive as the comments of some of the fucking congressmen in the GOP in the last decade. They still remained politicians. Elon Musk on Twitter, like 2 days ago, openly mocked people who were opposing the coup in Bolivia that made Elon Musk incredibly wealthy. He said, and I quote, "We will coup whoever we want." Mocking people for being opposed to the murder and death of people in other countries because the elites benefit from it. Elon's not going to get canceled for that. His stock price is still rising. I mean, there are people in the GOP right now who have tested positive for the coronavirus and still won't admit that fucking masks are effective. And yet when they get hit for misinformation, it's a free speech issue. And yet if somebody corrects them, they ignore it. It's not about an open exchange of ideas. It's not about free speech. It's about whatever fucking rationalization and justification they need to say to get their voters on board with continuing to support them, while getting their owners and donors to continue funding them. It's not about the truth. It's not about free speech. It's not about civil rights. It's not about making the country a better place. It's all about money and power and justifying continuing to get money and power. And by people treating these issues like they're legitimate issues and honestly debating whether or not cancel culture is a problem, it just goes to show you that people are way more willing to accept a lie from an authority figure than the truth from anybody else. Meanwhile, elite opinion is doing just fine. You know, they're blasting people for holding them accountable, and they're winning the argument because they're framing it as a free speech argument when it's not. Meanwhile, if you're a worker and you speak out against your boss, or you try to start a union, or you have a political opinion that somebody doesn't like, or people just generally don't think you're a very cool person to hang out with, you can be fired for no cause, basically in any state in the union. It's called right to work laws. And so there's no protection at all for free speech in the workplace for individuals. There's no protection from free speech for leftists from the government. There's no protection for free speech coming from the right, who are the free speech party, unless they support the message. So where exactly is this mythical land of free speech and self-expression that we're all told is that we're living in? It only is a land of free speech and expression if you are one of the elite shapers of cultural opinion. A New York Times journalist, or professor at University of Berkeley, or on down the line. If you are not one of those elite shapers of public opinion, you don't have free speech. You don't need to be canceled. You can just be fired. You're expendable. And so talking about cancel culture and free speech, you're really talking about shaming people into not using one of the only methods of power that they have in our society. And that method of power is making a fuss on the internet, which causes stock prices to drop. If I started making public accusations against a company for improper and immoral behavior, and I have good evidence for it, and I get other people on board, that company's stock price is going to drop. It's going to force them to deal with that issue, or at least find a way to wave it off, wave the criticism off. But it pressures and holds people to account. It's one of the only measures that common people have to affect the world around them, because the political system is completely resistant to the idea of change. Both sides, Democrat and Republican. So people use cultural institutions and, social media and these methods of communication to hold people to account, that's something we've always considered to be free speech, and now that's a problem. It's not free speech, it's cancel culture, it's toxic, it's degrading the fabric of America. No. What is degrading the fabric of America is an obstructionist political system that refuses to fix the fucking issues in this country. A reactionary wing of the country which wants every bad thing that's done in history to continue simply on the name of tradition. And 3, cultural institutions which have more incentive to uphold the status quo than to hold people to account. That's the real fucking problem, folks. Not the people who are mad and who are in the streets. People being mad is a barometer. It's a barometer for how broken the political system is. If people can't make the sorts of changes that make their lives bearable, they will riot. Stop blaming cancel culture. That's not what this is about. This is about an unwillingness to confront issues. That when people address issues and grievances, things need to change. Slavery didn't get canceled by the abolitionists. It was an objectively immoral and awful idea that was greedy and benefited powerful people. And elite cultural institutions and elite thinkers in the culture spent hundreds of years justifying its existence and telling you why it was correct, even though your own common sense and moral judgment would tell you it was wrong. And the same process is happening right now in America. These people, this Harper's letter, and these people complaining about cancel culture are trying to get you to accept that everything is fine. You are the problem for complaining about it. That's gaslighting. There is no qualitative difference between that kind of attitude and behavior and an abusive husband who hits his wife for asking for mercy. And in fact, the ideological differences between the Democrats and the Republicans are mostly not if we're going to treat people better, but how we're going to lie to them. The conservatives will lie to you by saying that everything is just fine and we just need to keep going. The Democrats will lie to you by saying that it's not fine and we're going to change it, and then they never do. And when you have decades of that sort of political obfuscation on both sides of the aisle, where there is no ability for common people to have their voices heard, you don't live in a land of free speech and free opportunity. You live in an oligarchy. You have no freedom as an individual. You have no freedom of speech. You can be fired from your job for saying anything. Criticizing the government, criticizing your boss. You can be jailed by the government for saying anything that's subversive. But you, as an individual who has no rights and freedoms, really are being expected to support the rights and freedoms of millionaires and billionaires who tell you that by supporting them, you are supporting yourself. That those rights and freedoms will trickle down as if by magic off of the balls of capitalism and straight into your mouth. Please, if you are a person and you are out there and you think by supporting, the free speech of some person at the New York Times, that gives you the right to organize a union at your workplace, which is a fundamental free speech issue, you are deluded. You can sign on to the ideas of that Harper's letter, go out into the streets of Portland to justifiably use your First Amendment constitutional rights and end up in the back of an unmarked van heading to a black site to be interrogated. That's the level of free speech that we have in this country. So I don't want to hear that this is a radical left issue. Just like in Nazi Germany, the radical left are the ones being targeted first, because the radical left are the ones who oppose government overreach. We are the ones who support the rights of individuals. The left wants people to be able to express themselves. It just acknowledges that the range of acceptable, expressible opinions is not 100% of all opinions. I, as a responsible person, do not have the right to sit here in this chair with this camera pointed on me and tell lies. That would be a fundamental breach of the implicit contract between me as an educator and an advocate and you as the person who is listening to me. That violates the social contract in the most fundamental way. And yet, we live in a world where our politicians and our cultural institutions lie to us at the behest of power all day. That's why people didn't want Nick Cannon to apologize. Because they saw Nick Cannon as a person who was supporting, and I'm talking about black people in general here, or specifically relatively radically minded black nationalists or, leftist black people, and some people from other races, certainly. But generally speaking, people on the left, anti-racist advocates, SJWs, were not the people who were mad at Nick Cannon for what he said. The people who got Nick Cannon canceled were the reactionary conservative hypocrites that can't wait to punish anyone on the left, who can't wait to punish anyone who deviates from the culture of white supremacy and capitalism in this country. And they had the audacity in the same week to say, it's a free speech issue, we support free speech unconditionally, and cancel Nick Cannon. I don't put up with these arguments. There's no way that me, sitting here as an intelligent, rational, and informed person, am ever going to buy into that obvious, hypocritical gaslighting. You want me to believe that it's fundamentally the same for Nick Cannon to say something against white people as it is for white people to say things against descendants of slaves? It's not the same thing. One is a turn of phrase based off of racial violence that they suffered. One is the victim using the oppressor's language against the oppressor. The other is the oppressor continuing to oppress. Now, I don't think what Nick Cannon said was correct, and I've said that through all these video series. I don't think what he said was correct. Melanin is not a spiritual molecule connected to skin color and compassion. Black people were original Hebrews. They are not the original Hebrews. There were 12 tribes. Lots of different people. White people are a little less because of the color of their skin and because of certain genetic attributes. You can make that argument if you wanted to be a race scientist about it. But we all agree that race science isn't really real and needs to go away. And if you're a white person, you were offended by what he said, then it gives you all the more incentive to oppose race science when you hear it from other white people. Honestly. That's what you need to take away from this. Is if Nick Cannon's racism offended you, become a more severe and ardent anti-racist advocate. If his anti-Semitism offended you, do more to educate yourself and be an advocate for opposing anti-Semitism. But saying cancel Nick Cannon 2 days after you said I'm pro-free speech and then never addressing racism ever again because that's SJW shit, fuck off. The only reason those three opinions can go one after another is because the GOP and the right reactionary wing of this country's political institutions and cultural institutions are fucking hypocrites. Come at me. If you think I'm wrong, go down into the comments, tell me why any of the common GOP social talking points aren't just sheer hypocrisy to own the liberals. I'll give you a perfect example. Trump didn't want to wear face masks. It's not based on science, it's not based on evidence, it's not based on rationality. All those things point to wearing masks. He stubbornly insisted for months that you didn't need to wear them and you shouldn't wear them while cases rose. Once the case count got so high that he couldn't hide from the criticism anymore, then he started wearing a mask. Proving from the beginning that he was wrong, he knew he was wrong, it wasn't based on information that he had, he just didn't want to do it. And he made up whatever fucking excuse he needed, both to justify it the first time and then to justify switching to a complete opposite point later. This is a thread that we're going to be milking. The next couple of videos are going to be a lot of my unreleased anger towards the hypocritical horseshit of the GOP. This Nick Cannon cancel culture thing was just a little bit of a good way to kind of start to dig into it. So coming up, we're going to be looking at hypocrisy in the GOP when it comes to, criticisms of its own policies, hypocrisy in the GOP when it comes to covering and defending for Trump, hypocrisy in the GOP when it comes to their stances on populism, supporting the well-being of the working class. And then the hypocrisy, I think we'll probably cap this hypocrisy series off with a really good one on fake Christianity. Because I've been dying to talk about the fake Christianity and science denial that's in the GOP as well. So, if you're a Republican, thanks for tuning in. The next couple of videos are not going to be great for our relationship. And I hope by the end of it, you still forgive me and you still tune in. If not, hopefully we'll see each other on the other side of the upcoming civil war that will come if we can't listen to each other and actually try to work on the problems in this country. Thanks for tuning in. I've been angry as usual. Peace.